Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. As you can probably tell from my accent, I've been awake since 3:30, and I feel very privileged to be invited to speak at a gathering of people who really are at the cutting edge and very knowledgeable around improving the experience of urban life and also developing better urban futures. As has been mentioned, I work for Shell, and we've come to recognize how much the nature of urban development has an impact on the patterns of consumption of energy. So it's very, very important to us, and that's why I'm going to particularly talk about some work that we've conducted over the last couple of years that's summarized in this little booklet that you'll find out there somewhere around future cities. It's also pretty cool, as my 16-year-old son would say, to be here in Detroit. Not just because of the stories we've heard, which have been very, very interesting, and thank you for that, but also, as you can tell from my age, I was a youth of the late 60s and early 70s, so the name Detroit was part of the iconography of my musical misspent youth. So it's really been fun, and I was really quite blown away when I saw where the Tamla houses were. So, because in my mind, this had to be huge, and yet to see where that creativity came from was quite an inspiration. And I hope that you will find some of the things you hear about today being an inspiration of how the grassroots can create something that changes the city and changes the world. Now, when thinking about the future, clearly there are uncertainties involved. Nobody has a crystal ball on the future. And we're generally characterized as a company of Dutch engineers and Scottish accountants. So we tend to think of things in a very numerate way, a very kind of geeky way. But also, over time, we've developed an understanding that others see the world differently. And so we have US lawyers in our company. And they look at the future like this. Now, I assume you've read this, and that you're willing to click, I accept. Because otherwise I can't go on. Is that okay? Great. But as we think about the future, we think about how can we bring lenses that help us to make better decisions now, understanding that our investments have an impact to our company, but also in the world over many decades ahead, as a major energy and infrastructure company and a major technology company. And so we developed the scenario approach over 40 years ago to help us grapple with an understanding that there are some things that are relatively predetermined in any particular outlook. Often demographics is relatively predetermined over a number of years. But also there are critical uncertainties. And those may be technological uncertainties, but they're very often uncertainties associated with the way that people make choices. And that depends on their background, on their education, on their culture, on their history, even what they ate in the morning. And so that creates an uncertainty field. And we find scenarios help us to make out the main features of the future landscape, but also the main uncertainties, and make better decisions as a result. You know, the behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman has talked about the bias of people. What you see is all there is. Well, through scenarios, we try to stretch the horizons, giving people lenses to see more than what they otherwise would see. Now, when it came to thinking about issues of resource security in the years ahead, we understood there was a very important, what we call a stress nexus between energy security, water security, food security, and broader environmental issues, such as the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we brought together experts from all over the world to debate these issues. And we found there are about 100 different connected issues, which means nearly 100,000 links between them. And we had moments of great existential angst as we see how complex this was. But we also brought in some complexity scientists to kind of help map out which were the most significant issues in the playing field that connected this nexus. And what they identified was that there were probably 15 most important issues, of which 2 stood out, one of which was almost like a market and regulatory issue, which was the pricing of resources and also emissions and the regulatory field around them. And the second was urbanization. That this actually was one of the key drivers of energy security, water security, and food security globally. And so that is the first lesson of about a half dozen lessons that I think I've learned and that I wanted to share with you over the coming period. And then we'll hopefully have a bit of time for questions. So it's a critical global issue. And effectively, it's a key predetermined trend. We know we've just gone past the 50% mark in the urbanization of the global population. And by 2050, we'll move from just over 3 billion people in urban settings to almost 7 billion people in urban settings. And people will look back, I believe, in the future as the period from 1950 to 2050 as being the century of the city, when most of the world urbanized. But also, the nature of that urban development is a critical uncertainty. How will people choose to develop the urban environment? And it makes a big difference from an energy point of view. Did you know that the average US citizen uses 3 times as much energy for personal transport as the average European or the average Japanese? And it's not just because of the size of your vehicles and the energy efficiency. It's because people in the US drive twice as far. And the reason for that, when you peel it back with the econometrics, is because of the nature of urban development, the sprawling cities with poor public transport. So how cities develop is a key uncertainty in the whole of resource security globally. You know the incredible pace of urban development. Just putting it in US terms, the equivalent of a New York City every 6 weeks. 2 Detroits every week. But it's actually not in the advanced economies that most of the action is taking place. I think there are about 10 cities in the US with more than 1 million inhabitants, and about 35 in the continent of Europe. But in China alone, there are already over 220. And so, in 25 years, this just illustrates the development of Shanghai. So this was Shanghai in 1990, and look, for instance, at that building that is on the left with the tall building with the slightly greenish roof. Can you see that? Well, if I just kind of take that forward a little bit through to more recent times, that's the amount of development that there has been in Shanghai. Very, very important to recognize this as a local phenomenon, but also a global phenomenon with global influence. What else have we learned? Here's the second lesson. How important urban density is as a driver of resource use. This happens to be an example looking at greenhouse gas emissions, which are essentially energy use emissions from Detroit between the high density areas and the low density areas. And you can see the huge difference there that compactness of an area makes in terms of the use of energy, not just for transport, but also the types of building operations, etc. So clearly, it's a lesson about the value of smart development of compact areas. But there is a dilemma here. If you look at any of the surveys from The Economist or from Mercer about city livability, the cities that always score the highest on livability are cities like Vancouver or Melbourne, which are relatively low density, have that space. So it seems that there is a dilemma here, and yet you look at cities like Singapore or London, which are able to combine high scores on livability with high density and compactness. So there are smart ways of getting across that particular challenge. We found that no cities are alike. Each is unique in its particular circumstances. But with over 500 cities in the world with more than 750,000 people, we couldn't deal with each city individually. So we found a half dozen archetypes that were helpful for us to deal with the plethora of urban forms. And those are described in that booklet there. But essentially, they cluster according to their population size, their prosperity, and their urban density. So you have the large number of underdeveloped urban centers, like a Marrakesh or an Algiers, and then if those grow and remain relatively low prosperity, you get the developing mega hubs like Nairobi or like Chongqing, and then ultimately the cities like Manila and Lagos, which are very large in population, low prosperity, but also becoming quite dense because of the pressures of the population. There are many prosperous communities. I flew in here from Amsterdam. That would be an example of a prosperous community, a Dubai or a Calgary. The sprawling metropolises like Houston or Rio de Janeiro. And ultimately, the very high population, high prosperity, and compact cities like Singapore or Istanbul or Hong Kong as the urban powerhouses. And we found that a lot of the features of city development and city resource use can be captured in those archetypes. But also, as we look forward at the patterns of development, which are important when you're thinking about scenarios, we've also found 6 typical pathways of development, ranging from slum proliferation, the importance of controlled urbanization, and also, as has been experienced here in Detroit over a number of decades, urban decline. I've highlighted the 2 in red particularly because those are the ones that have the biggest impact on energy consumption in the future years. So if we look at the next really 10 to 15 years, you can see that most energy growth is coming from the late stage growth in those mega cities, those very, very underprivileged, crowded cities, but also through controlled urbanization, the ability to grow in population and in prosperity and compactness at the same time. So I come to the third lesson about the way that these pathways seem to progress. In simple terms, I'm sorry it is simplistic, but it kind of helps grasp some of the essence, I think. You can think of the virtuous circle, where there is a competitive commercial advantage, which might be a geographical, of being a trading hub, or a cluster of industries that work together, or a special economic zone. And that creates the capacity to invest for the private sector, to invest in efficiency, in developing the ecostructure around the industry, but also for the authorities to invest in infrastructure and in amenities. And that attracts more talent, builds the talent pool, creates greater demand for new amenities, creates the connections that help build the next wave of competitive advantage. And so you get that particular virtuous circle. But as you know, indeed, a virtuous circle can also go in reverse, and you get vicious circles. And that's not only been experienced in the case of Detroit and other industrial cities in the US, but I come from the north of England, and I've seen it in places like Liverpool and Manchester, even in the Scandinavian countries, places like Malmo. And so we recognize these two directions, and so we have a set of pathways that you can read about in more detail if you're interested, that we call room to maneuver, where there is sufficient financial capital or resource capital or leadership capital or civic capital to maneuver against all the different pressures on city development and keep reinventing and going around that circle. But you also get the trapped transition, which Detroit found itself in for a number of decades. So if you actually go back to 1960s, I'm sure you know, it's interesting to compare these different pathways, with Singapore being about 1.6 million people back then, having a quarter of the population below the poverty line, having a third of the population in squatter camps or in slums, and is now a city that is over 5 million people and recognized as one of the leading thriving cities in the globe. Detroit was again at that time just under 2 million people, the highest income per head in the United States, and now has come into a position where it's 700,000 people, high functional illiteracy, high poverty, and as has already been noted, with essentially a third of the lots vacant or derelict. And yet, there is the capacity to write off and reset. I used to live in London, and London was one of the most polluted cities in the world. The great 1952 London smog is very, very significant, but was able to reset. Pittsburgh, I guess in the US, and I believe we have the mayor of Pittsburgh here, seems to have been a city that has reset. And Detroit is going through that process, it seems. It'd be interesting to hear more about that in the period when we're all together. So we found these 5 factors enable room to maneuver. We worked with the Center for Livable Cities in Singapore, gathering people together from different backgrounds, and recognized that there were a variety of blending top-down approaches and grassroots approaches towards creating room to maneuver. So flexible planning, so having a plan, the Singapore concept plan of 1971, its new plan of 1991, its current plans, flexible adapting. In London, the decision to aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to, I think, 40% of the 1990 level by 2025, created a planning vision that enabled things over time to react. So bringing in congestion charging, bringing in the the so-called Boris bikes, cycling within the city. You need consistent investment, private sector and public sector, but also how those come together has been noted. So Berlin in 1997 reached an agreement between the Berlin Senate and commercial leaders that 75% of future building developments would incorporate solar thermal technology within them. And since that time also, 230,000 refurbished buildings in Berlin now have half the energy use that they had beforehand. The capacity to implement. Clearly, major infrastructure projects in the public sector, but the commercial engine is the greatest driver of the capacity to implement. So the ability to unleash the commercial sector. So in Copenhagen, which had a flexible plan also about becoming climate neutral, has managed to encourage the green technology area such that it has grown by over 50% in the last 5 years. Building trust, very important, very, very central. And it's clearly in some parts of the world, that's all to do with combating corruption. Both small-scale corruption, but also the abusive influence of vested interests. But it's also about transparency. Helsinki would be an example of a smart city that has made huge amount of its data available for everybody to see transparently and build trust that way, and to interact with it, and to have apps that allow the residents to highlight where there are issues that need to be addressed, fix my street type of issues. And finally, collaboration architecture. It has been mentioned that there needs to be a way to bring together the different interests. We've just done a workshop with Metro Manila, and particularly one city within Metro Manila, Manila. And what we've seen, as we've seen elsewhere in the world, is just how difficult it is when you have multiple authorities to find the way to come to decisions that are required. And you have to build an architecture. So in London, the creation of Transport for London as a single institution going across London was very significant. Lesson 5, maybe there are some lessons from our experience. We've just spent several years working with the Chinese State Council on their future energy pathways that feeds into their thinking about their 5-year plans. But one stream was about urban development. And we've actually got about 10 lessons from that if they apply, they can incorporate the 300 million extra urban residents that are going to be in place in the next 20 years within the current boundaries of cities, and also have 30% less transport energy use and 40% less residential energy use than the business as usual outlook. And it requires these kinds of factors, understanding the city in its ecological context with an inventory, really addressing building efficiency, reducing mega plot sizes, small plot sizes, having flexible zoning so you have residential and commercial and industrial activities well integrated. Really recognizing the impact of transit and thinking through the whole transit-oriented development, having greater density around hubs of transport, building microgrids, enabling pedestrians and cyclists to be very effective. Do you realize in Amsterdam, where I flew in from, 60% of people cycle every day? Incredible impact on improving the quality of life in that city. Also time-oriented development, recognizing the impact of decisions now over time and thinking ahead and having, if you like, scenarios about that. And understanding the value of integrating things like waste management with water management with power generation, as again has occurred in Amsterdam. And ultimately, finding the way to take new developments and bring them into the urban core. So, some of the discussions in the next couple of days will be around Detroit and enabling room to maneuver here. And so if I bring my final lessons here, if they're of any value to Detroit or any other city, broaden the frame. People think in isolation and in silos, but we need an and perspective here. We need to think about efficient infrastructures, but also efficient end use. One of the things that I think is quite fascinating is the way that indeed younger generations are being encouraged to think about energy efficiency. And we have outside there a few examples from our eco-marathon cars, where we encourage young people to develop vehicle concepts and race them against each other. They have a lot of fun doing that. And we'll be holding, as Shell, a Shell eco-marathon here in Detroit in April of next year. Think about clean energy, energy efficiency, gas instead of coal in many parts of the world, as well as the green energy, the huge development there has been in the application of solar energy, which we believe by 2060 could become the largest single primary energy source globally. Already been mentioned, the value of top-down and grassroots being blended together. And finally, what I call the dance. I mentioned music before. Now, I'm a middle-aged man, so I don't dance very well. You can understand that. You don't want to see me do it, do you? No. But you actually need policymakers and business and civil society, academia, philanthropists, NGOs, to dance well together, to have the kind of collaboration that enables that and perspective. So indeed, having the kind of plan that was mentioned in the last talk for Detroit. But one maybe final lesson, which might be a recommendation for Detroit or another city, is to consider the development of scenarios over time that enable you to refresh the way you think about the way that the different actors and dancers function together. And you learn to recognize what brings the more beneficial outcomes and what brings the more troublesome outcomes. So, those are my set of lessons from the work that we've done. I hope they have some value to you. And I'm happy now to hand back over to Gordon. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, what I'm